Chicago, Illinois, 1920s. There was a seismic change to American life in that decade, and there was one group ready to take advantage of it, violently. In doing so, they gave Chicago a reputation that has lasted into the present day. It's the history of murder, and I'm your host, Clare O'Donoghue. On May 11, 1920, inside a restaurant he owned on Chicago's near South Side, the city's first crime boss, Big Jim Colosimo, was shot in the head. There are two possible reasons. One was personal and had to do with his new bride, and the other had to do with the law. About 4 months earlier, on January 17th, Prohibition had gone into effect, and there was now fierce competition in Chicago to take advantage of that. Colosimo was born in Calabria, Italy in 1878 and emigrated to Chicago when he was 18. When he arrived in the city, crime looked very different than it would in a few decades, according to Paul Durica, director of exhibitions at the Chicago History Museum.
The start of the 20th century, I think would be perhaps an overstatement to call crime in Chicago organized. There was certainly a lot of it and took different forms. You had like street gangs, you had a lot of gambling interests, you had a lot of vice and prostitution.
Colosimo quickly got involved in petty crime and moved his way up, combining his love of women and money to lead him and his first wife, Victoria, to open a brothel.
He kind of really began to build his criminal enterprise through marriage because he married a woman who was already a successful madam, and they kind of expanded from one brothel to a whole chain of brothels.
They were wildly successful. It took only a few years for their operation to expand to almost 200 brothels across the city. But he wasn't satisfied. Before him, the Chicago Underworld was split up. Some focused on gambling, others on prostitution, and still others on bribing labor unions and politicians. Colosimo united all three vices, and in doing so, he made a name for himself. Or several names.
Colosimo had a couple different nicknames. One of them was Big Jim. Another nickname was Diamond Jim. And I think that gives you a sort of insight into his personality, which is that he was very loud, flashy, and flamboyant.
He earned a reported $50,000 per month, about $800,000 now. In 1940, author Herbert Asbury wrote about Colosimo.
He wore a diamond ring on every finger, diamond studs in his shirt front, a huge diamond horseshoe was pinned to his vest, diamond links joined his cuffs, and his belt and suspended buckles were set with diamonds.
By the mid-1910s, he had the largest criminal enterprise in the city, and it was composed of men from varied backgrounds: Irish, Jewish, Italian, Greek, and others. He wanted to make money, and he was willing to work with whoever wanted to help him. But he also wanted something else: popularity.
Colosimo, though, had another side to his character, which will be something that a lot of figures in Chicago's underworld will share, which is that they had their criminal side, and then they had what I would want to call like their kind of like public relations side. And in Colosimo's case, it took the form of opening a very popular restaurant and cabaret on the south side of Chicago, which was known for serving its Italian dishes. It was known for its musical acts. And it became a really popular night spot among Chicago's young people, but also among Chicago's elite as well. It became a place that tourists would even go to. All of them sort of winkingly knowing that Colosimo had connections to crime.
For Colosimo, once a poor kid who needed petty crime to keep him fed, life looked good.
But then he does the thing that like a kind of flashy guy who wears lots of jewelry and likes fancy clothes is probably destined to do, which is he ditches his older wife for a much younger companion, turns to one of the women who was actually performing at his restaurant and cabaret in Dale Winter. And that really begins to also, I think, create some concern among Colosimo's associates, which is now he's devoting too much of attention to his young bride. It certainly alienated and frustrated his ex-wife, who herself was a fairly accomplished underworld figure. And I think it begins to sort of create the conditions for Colosimo's downfall.
But it wasn't the only thing going against him.
Everything changes in January of 1920, because in January of 1920, national prohibition goes into effect. And suddenly there's this immense opportunity to provide alcoholic beverages, beer, wine, whiskey, whatever, to people who certainly have a desire for it, can no longer either have it manufactured legally or transported legally or purchase it legally. And so there arises this opportunity for an entire black market to emerge.
Prohibition created a problem for the crime boss, but not for the reason you'd expect.
Before we continue, please remember to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to our channel. It will help us continue to make new content. Now, back to the story.
Colosimo did not see Prohibition as an opportunity. He was already making big money with little local interference. Getting involved in bootlegging would attract federal agents, and he believed they would be harder to pay off. That could mean his men would be arrested, and he could too. He didn't think Prohibition would last, and he thought it was smarter to let someone else take the risks. But to the men in his syndicate, it also meant someone else would get the profits. And that was unacceptable. On May 11th, 1920, the day he was shot, the 42-year-old Colosimo had just returned from his honeymoon, and he was checking on things at his chic restaurant. The place was frequented by some of the country's most celebrated, including opera singer Enrico Caruso and famed attorney Clarence Darrow, as well as by mobsters, politicians, and socialites. At that moment, it was closed. He stepped inside the restaurant when someone aimed a gun at the back of his head and shot him just behind the right ear. That gunman was never identified, but word is that it was a New York mobster named Frankie Yale.
Frankie Yale, another Italian immigrant who had kind of come up as a young criminal, but associated with Al Capone. Yale comes to Chicago, hides out in the cloakroom of the restaurant. Colosimo's drawn there on a pretense of meeting someone. Once Colosimo arrives, the only person there to greet him is Frankie Yale in the cloakroom, who shoots him a couple of times from behind, resulting in Colosimo's death.
After the shooting, Yale was stopped by police at the Chicago train station. He told them he'd been in the city visiting for the day from New York. He was sent on his way. Back in New York, he had worked for a man named Johnny Torrio. If Frankie Yale had done the hit, was it because Torrio had asked him?
John Torrio, like Colosimo, had been born in Italy, emigrated to the United States. Like Colosimo, had at a very early age gotten involved in crime, primarily through street gangs, so like burglary and holdups and robbery, and then just general theft and mayhem. And, through developing a reputation in his youth of kind of not only becoming part of a gang, but also organizing that gang and turning it into a much more profitable criminal enterprise.
Torrio was second in command to Colosimo, and some say he was also his first wife's cousin, but that's just speculation. He had been Colosimo's enforcer and advisor. He had, for example, cautioned Colosimo that divorcing Victoria for the young Dale Winter was a bad idea. Victoria's family would not take kindly to the move. In fact, he's alleged to have made a rather prophetic statement when he learned of the divorce.
It's your funeral.
Torrio was not flashy like his boss. He was calm and polite, never swore, was faithful to his wife despite helping to run brothels across the city, and he didn't drink or smoke. But he didn't mind if others had vices he didn't. Unlike Colosimo, Torrio saw Prohibition as a gift to the crime world.
And figures like Torrio see the potential in this, right? Even though national prohibition has gone into effect and there's, I guess, a broad popular support behind it, there's still many, many people that were opposed to it. And many people, and particularly many different communities in urban centers like Chicago, for whom drinking is a big part of their cultural practice, that they don't support it. And they're going to continue to try to figure out ways to drink. So who's going to, meet that need? Well, this is where criminal elements can step in. And Torrio tries to convince Colosimo to begin to engage in bootlegging. But Colosimo seems disinterested in it.
Although Torrio was never arrested for being involved in Colosimo's death, it has been passed down as truth through the generations. One sign that people point to that Torrio was involved in the hit is that he never went after any rival gangs for the killing. But does that mean he killed Colosimo?
As a historian, the history of organized crime is really problematic for me. You don't have a lot of the sort of resources that you generally turn to as a historian. Book after book after book that's been written about this era in Chicago's history. A lot of them are drawing from the personal testimonies and memories of different figures who were involved, but who knows how accurate those memories are. And certain just stories and legends began to take root.
Whatever the truth, Torrio quickly swooped in to fill the vacuum left in the wake of the murder. Interestingly, Dale Winter, Colosimo's bride of 3 weeks, declined any inheritance and quickly left town. His personal wealth went to his first wife. Torrio was tough. He had cut his teeth on crime as a member of the 5 Points gang in New York. He was also known for being smart. He got the nickname Fox because even his enemies saw him as clever. Unlike many of the tough guys he knew, he didn't choose violence unless he had to. And as he moved from enforcer to boss, he advised others to follow his lead.
Use bribes instead of bullets. We're businessmen, not the U.S. Marines.
He came to Chicago in 1909, and 10 years later, he was joined by a young Brooklyn native he'd mentored, Al Capone. Torrio and Capone were so close that Torrio was the godfather of Capone's only child, Albert Francis. Just months before Colosimo's murder, another of Chicago's early mobsters was killed, Maurice Moss Enright. Enright, from County Kerry, Ireland, was, at 36, one of the most powerful gangsters in Chicago. He maintained a brutal control of labor unions and worked with Johnny Torrio to get political protection. But some say that Torrio may have had a hand in getting him killed in February of 1920. When Enright was arriving at his house that night, a car slowed next to him and shots were fired out the window. It appears to have been the first drive-by shooting in Chicago. Whoever killed Enright and Colosimo, they were gone. And now Torrio was the undisputed boss of Chicago. And it was a good time to be boss. He now controlled gambling, prostitution, and racketeering in the city, and the way was clear to control the latest illegal vice.
The argument for prohibition is that intoxicating spirits are detrimental to the health and well-being of people of the United States, right? They are addictive substances. They lead to men in particular shirking their familial responsibilities, failing as producers and workers because they become alcoholics. And it's also taking people out of the house and putting them in saloons. And so the belief was that if you enforce prohibition, that people will stop drinking as much, if hopefully completely stop drinking, right? That was really the goal. And that'll lead to a better home life and more productive labor and so on and so forth.
With the passage of the 18th Amendment, prohibition may have been the law of the land. But in Chicago, it appeared to be more of a suggestion. Mayor Big Bill Thompson stated publicly that the city was, quote, wetter than the Atlantic Ocean, unquote, and it was about to flood.
What's interesting is that if you look at some of the studies done within the first 5 years of the 13 years of national prohibition going into effect, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if anything, ban on intoxicating spirits actually led to an increase in drinking, and certainly to a change in the drinking practices of most Americans. Prior to prohibition going into effect, you had a lot of bars and then saloons, and these were almost entirely guy-only spaces, right? Men went to drink at bars, right? And they would, put their foot up on the brass rail and they would spit into a spittoon and they would drink several beers or whiskeys and so on. These were men's spaces. And women, that's not to say women didn't drink, but they didn't drink socially and they certainly didn't mix with men as much or certainly not most middle class and upper middle class women. But what changes after prohibition goes into effect is now you have these kind of underground drinking establishments, whether it's the speakeasy or the cabaret, or even things within people's houses like the beer flat. And you begin to see like a much greater mixing of men and women drinking together, which changes. Women began to at least seemingly drink more than they had prior to Prohibition.
With demand increasing, Torrio jumped in to make sure there was supply. Breweries were scrambling and many faced bankruptcy, so Torrio made behind-the-scenes purchases, with the old owners staying to create the product.
He hires lots of people. I mean, this becomes a huge criminal enterprise. I mean, first you've got to figure out like where to source the booze from, right? So a lot of stuff is kind of smuggled in illegally from Canada or from Cuba, places like that. But a lot of it's made within the United States. So you have to set up distilleries. Breweries already exist, so you can make a lot of beer using that infrastructure that's there, and you can hire the old personnel.
He also hired many of the city's petty criminals to act as protection for the liquor and the men who ran it. Ironically, Chicago's crime rate reduced as these ex-burglars and stick-up men now had real jobs to keep them occupied. And since Torrio himself had what was sometimes referred to as bland charm, there was, for a time, a belief that this criminal enterprise of bootlegging could make the city more peaceful. Torrio himself agreed with that assessment.
There are millions in booze, plenty for everyone. All we got to do is respect the other guy's area and we'll make money.
I mean, if you were to take a look at him, and it's easy to find photographs of him, you might think he was like a butcher or like a clerk or something, right? He doesn't like fit our idea of what a gangster looks like, right? He just looks like a very kind of like modest, sort of middle-class guy. And, you know, I think that in many ways was also sort of reflective of his character. Because for Torrio, crime is a business, and the ultimate goal is just to make a lot of money. And so if there's a way to do that that's efficient and that minimizes attention from law enforcement, that minimizes any kind of violence or conflict, that's the path to take. In the belief, rightly, that there was so much money to make off bootlegging that there was no reason that conflict should ever emerge. Everybody could get fabulously wealthy off of it. So like, why fight, right? Just like share the proceeds. And you don't really have to worry about law enforcement because you also have enough left over to pretty much bribe anybody who might come, you know, sniffing around and seeing if you're doing anything criminal. And so Torrio really tries to kind of create this structure, but he doesn't take into account the mercurial personalities that he's dealing with or the fact that there really is no limit to human greed.
One of the main mercurial personalities Torrio faced worked in a flower shop. One of the owners of Schofield's Flowers on North State Street, across from Holy Name Cathedral, was a former choir boy from Central Illinois. His name was Charles Dean O'Banion.
Dean O'Banion is another one of those figures who's more or less a lifelong criminal. And he's got a very kind of lucrative part of Chicago because he kind of controls the area known as the Gold Coast, where the city's most affluent residents reside. And they, just like anybody else across the city of Chicago, still want to be able to drink, even though Prohibition is in effect.
At the start of Prohibition, O'Banion and Torrio made a deal. Torrio's gang would make the liquor and O'Banion's would deliver it. At least that was how Torrio saw it. But O'Banion had other plans.
And let Johnny Torrio make the stuff. I'll steal what I want of it.
When he was 12, he was hit by a streetcar, hurting his leg. It left him with a slight limp, though it was said that others knew not to mention it. O'Banion had been mentored by a safecracker named Charles Reiser. Not much is known about him, other than he was violent. He bragged about killing his first wife and his business partner. He took O'Banion under his wing, bringing him on safecracking jobs. After an attempted robbery in October of 1921, he was hospitalized. Though he had 10 bullet wounds in him, the hospital ruled it a suicide, and the police determined that there would be no need to investigate. Unlike his mentor, O'Banion had a more likable personality. He was described as generous, loyal, and kind. There was a story of how he'd paid the hospital bills for a disabled man he barely knew. Alternatively, he was described as cruel, unforgiving, and though he was not known to live the high life, he was willing to do anything to have money.
O'Banion is one of those figures who's a mix of contradictions, because I think for him, similar to Torrio, although he was more prone to violence, I mean, crime was just like, that was like his work. That was like his business, right? But he also had a life apart from that. So, I mean, again, he seemed like someone who had, a fairly stable, healthy relationship and was married. He seems like, even though the church maybe wanted to distance himself from him, he didn't want to distance himself from the church. He remained like a lifelong Catholic. And so there's this kind of two sides to his character, right? And, while he's also providing flowers and wreaths and things for gangland-related funerals, he's also like providing those for everyday weddings and funerals and things like that. And apparently he was a fairly skilled arranger of flowers and enjoyed that. He found it like to be a relaxing activity. When he was a young man, he was also a singing waiter at a restaurant in Chicago. Of course, he would also rob a lot of the customers at the restaurant, but he was known for having a beautiful tenor voice.
O'Banion didn't just run liquor for Torrio. He helped local politicians by committing election fraud. The gang ran gambling operations, and members were also burglars, stealing from warehouses and other businesses. One illegal enterprise they refused to get involved in was prostitution. They left it to Colosimo and then Torrio. O'Banion felt prostitution was immoral. Unlike the low-key Torrio, O'Banion was a celebrity. He made donations to charities, including local orphanages, gave loans to those who asked, and food to the poor.
All of these people, I mean, they're fully human. They did horrible things, and I don't think in any way they should be glamorized or popularized. But just because they also did horrible things didn't mean that they didn't share a lot of the same human interests and needs and wants that all of us have. And that's what you see when you look at figures like O'Banion.
By 1923, Mayor Thompson, who was on Torrio's payroll, was out, and a new mayor, William Deaver, took his place. He wasn't a fan of the 18th Amendment either, so he and the city council passed a resolution stating that beer and light wine should be allowed. They sent that to Congress, to no avail. When that didn't work, he put his personal opinion aside. He was not willing to overlook the law being broken. He authorized raids on breweries, pushed to end police corruption, and pledged to find the hideouts that gangsters used to hide their liquor supply. He has said to have told the police chief, quote, "This town will become dry," unquote. The mayor was putting pressure on the bootlegging business, and that meant pressure on O'Banion and Torrio. But O'Banion wasn't concerned about the mayor. He had another problem: the Jenner brothers. 6 brothers who formed a North Side gang who infiltrated O'Banion's territory, manufacturing and selling liquor.
O'Banion believes that in some ways he's not making as much money as he should. Torrio begins to try to appease him in different ways by giving him shares in different things and giving him some South Side locations to draw profit from, but it's not enough.
O'Banion looked to Torrio for help controlling the Jenner brothers, but Torrio declined.
Torrio is always the peacemaker because he recognizes that any kind of violence will just become problematic for the smooth operation of what they're trying to do, which is make as much money as possible.
O'Banion felt cheated, so he began to hijack the Jenner brothers' trucks with the help of 2 men in his gang, Polish immigrant Henry Wojciechowski, known as Jaime Weiss, and George Bugs Moran, a transplant from St. Paul, Minnesota. Jaime Weiss was known for having a quick temper. He once told a photographer, quote, "You take a picture of me and I'll kill you," unquote. His brother would remark that he'd only seen Jaime once in 20 years and, quote, "That was when he shot me," unquote.
Weiss is a volatile personality.
George Moran had an equally difficult personality. His nickname, Bugs, was because he was known to be unstable, or buggy, as people were sometimes called at the time. He hated the nickname. He was not smart, apparently, but he was cunning. And like Jaime Weiss, he was violent. O'Banion and his gang decided that the problems they were having with the Jenner brothers was also Torrio's fault. If he had agreed to help them, they could have stamped out the brothers quickly. O'Banion decided to set Torrio up. He called Torrio to a meeting, and then he tipped off the police.
O'Banion and Torrio owned interest in one of those long-shutter breweries, the Cybin Brewery. And O'Banion gets wind of the fact that the brewery is going to be raided. And so he sees this as an opportunity to basically sell his shares in the brewery to Torrio, claiming that he wants to get out of the business entirely, and then sells it to Torrio for about like $500,000 purportedly. And then both Torrio and O'Banion and several others are there when the police raid the brewery.
When he saw the police captain, he apparently said,
"You ought to get a raise."
The raid made a lot of people happy. More than 100,000 gallons of beer were destroyed, and a black book of police on the payroll was confiscated. 30 people were arrested, including O'Banion and Torrio.
O'Banion's able to kind of get out on bond easily. For Torrio, it's more complicated because he's got like prior convictions and causes a real hassle for him. And that, creates a lot of tension between the two.
There was pressure on Torrio to get rid of O'Banion. But O'Banion had a protector. Michael Merlo was a powerful politician and the head of Unione Siciliana, a group which often brokered conflicts between the city's underworld. He was also a good friend of Dean O'Banion, and that bought O'Banion some time in his conflict with Torrio, but not much.
Merlo is dying of cancer at the time that all of this is unfolding in 1924. And when Merlo ultimately dies early in November of 1924, and O'Banion begins to just kind of like needle different members of the Torrio Association and the Jenner brothers as well, the decision is made that O'Banion has to go.
The new president of Unione Siciliana was Angelo Jenna, who would not only not protect O'Banion, he would order the hit. O'Banion's flower shop was mainly a front for his illegal activities, but it was also a thriving business, something O'Banion himself liked to brag about.
Why, I'm just a florist. If I've ever been in the booze racket, I'm out now.
On November 9th, 1924, calls came into the shop with huge flower orders for the funeral of Mike Merlo. One of the callers that day asked O'Banion if he would be at the shop the next day around 1 o'clock. O'Banion said he would. At 1 p.m. on November 10th, 3 men entered the shop to pick up flowers for Mike Merlo's funeral. A shop employee, William Crutchfeld, had a bad feeling about the men and went into the back room. He later said he heard 5 shots in quick succession, followed by a pause, and then a 6th shot. When he heard the men leave, he came back out and found the 32-year-old Dean O'Banion dead.
After he dies, his associates purchase a $10,000 casket that was made in Philadelphia and shipped there. A huge funeral is held for him.
Thousands of people crammed the streets. People who knew him and those who didn't wanted one last glimpse of the man they saw as a celebrity. It said there were 26 truckloads of flowers at his funeral, including a basket of roses sent by Johnny Torrio's second in command, Al Capone. Jaime Weiss inherited O'Banion's empire. He is said to have told people that everything that mattered to him was gone. And there was another problem with the succession right from the start. Weiss had an aggressive form of arterial cancer that was terminal. At only 28, he was dying, and no amount of toughness would prevent it. The news made the already aggressive Weiss more violent. It said that he was the only man that Al Capone was ever afraid of. Dean O'Banion's death hadn't ended problems for Torrio or the Jenner brothers, or for Mayor Deaver and those who wanted the city to go straight. It had exacerbated them.
The death of O'Banion in November 1924 launches more or less a kind of tit-for-tat exchange between the North Side and the Chicago outfit.
On January 24th, 1925, Johnny Torrio and his wife Anna were outside their home when Jaime Weiss, Bugs Moran, and a third man confronted them. Torrio was shot several times. He survived, but barely. It took months for him to recover, and when he did, he told Capone something shocking.
It's all yours, Al. Me? I'm quitting. It's Europe for me.
So much attention is given to Capone, but Capone would never have gotten to where he ended up without Torrio, right? I mean, Torrio really is the one who kind of creates the whole South Side gang and creates the larger operation that Capone will then begin to sort of like try to take over piece by piece through violence. But it's Torrio who sets it up.
Johnny Torrio left behind an empire that grossed $1.2 million a month in today's money and went with his wife to Italy. On October 11th, 1926, Jaime Weiss, his bodyguard, a fellow gangster, his lawyer, and the lawyer's investigator parked near the flower shop that Weiss had taken over after O'Banion's death. As they walked to the shop, two gunmen, one armed with a Tommy gun, opened fire. Weiss and the gangster Patty Murray were killed immediately. The others were wounded. Even Holy Name Cathedral across from the flower shop took several bullets. The hit was alleged to have come on orders of Al Capone. With Jaime Weiss dead, George Bugs Moran took over the leadership of a gang that had lost 2 leaders violently in just 2 years. Johnny Torrio returned to the United States in 1928, but moved to New York, not Chicago. He did 2 years in prison for tax evasion in the 1930s, but mostly he lived a quiet life. On April 16, 1957, he had a heart attack in a barber's chair in Brooklyn. He was 75 years old. When Chicago entered 1929, there were 2 new crime bosses, Al Capone and Bugs Moran. The early days of organized crime in the city had given way to the men who would become legends, and they would take the lessons they learned from their bosses to give the city its infamous reputation. What do you think about this case? Please comment below. And if you liked this story, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like and notification buttons, and let us know if there are cases you'd like us to cover.